Hello. And here we are, finally. We're getting our bonus episodes back under control. Des, mate, it feels like only sort of last week that I was with you.
Yeah, there's been a lot happening in the Circus of Safety space at the moment. We had a conference last week, got lots of shows happening, which is pretty cool. Lots of activity.
Yeah, massive, right? Who would have thought we might have to give up our real jobs for this? Andy, how are you, mate?
Doing all right, thanks. Enjoyed the company at the conference last week. And
your company was enjoyed as well. So thank you for putting up with us. Now, I don't want to talk like he's not in the room because this is actually quite awkward. There is somebody else in the studio, and we're talking around him like he's not here, but we can see him. He's there. The one, the only, Mr. Greg Smith. How are you, Greg?
Good, thanks, Brenton. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for the chance to be here.
Oh, mate, looking forward to it. Hey, for those that don't appreciate the wonders of technology, I understand that we're not actually all sitting in a studio in the same room. Where are you dialing in from today, Greg?
I'm Perth, Western Australia, at the moment.
Oh.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
quite a time difference. Hence why I'm saying good afternoon, and you're saying still staying good morning.
I think it's still 5 hours or so that the time difference is. Yep.
Yeah, fantastic. Hey, listen, really appreciate you taking the time out. Now, we're kind of having a bit of a chat before we went and started the recording.
Yep.
Hopefully, I'm not having too many technical issues with my lagging, but Des is a bit of a fanboy, Greg. I've got to be honest. He's a wee fan of your work, mate. Now, as you were mentioning,
it's a bit reciprocal. It's a bit reciprocal, Brenton. I'm reading something of Des's at the moment, which I do owe him this week, which is already late. I'm a bit of a fan of the stuff he's doing as well.
Oh wow, this just got gushy.
It is, isn't it? Just a real bromance going on.
Oh my giddy aunt. This is going to make for TikTok gold, I tell you. This is going to make for TikTok gold. Well, as we've discussed, you're a big fan of the show. Well, that's what we're telling everybody anyway. And you've been watching every episode, and you followed with anticipation last year of the spinning wheel of death, and how every week it landed on a topic which wasn't Des's. And finally, I think last episode of the physical year last year, it landed on his topic. If it doesn't get documented, it didn't happen. I mean, do you think we rigged the show, Greg? I was going to ask that question. I know it's got nothing to do with the topic, but do you think we actually rigged the show in terms of what the spinning wheel of death lands on?
I have no idea. I would not even begin to guess. But I would have thought a topic like, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, is one that if you weren't rigging the show would have come up earlier. Because it's one because the documentation issue is something that gets talked about a fair bit.
Greg, stop using fancy words to try to confuse me, mate. It doesn't take a lot. You just got to keep it super simple. But
okay, no. All right, there you go.
Now, so listen.
It'll be a quick session.
Well, already you said more words than Des says in the whole show. So
I've noted that. I
think this is going to go for some time. Hey, mate, listen. So let's just kick. For those that don't know who you are, and like I said, that's probably highly unlikely. In fact, we were just talking. I think most people watching this show know you better than they know us. Do you just want to give listeners that we do have a global audience? I might add. Do you want to let people know a little bit about who you are, what you currently do to keep the lights on, sort of thing, and then we'll kind of look to jump into the topic.
So I am a Western Australian-based work health and safety lawyer. I've more or less been working as a lawyer for about 33, 35 years. I've jumped in and out of the law, and I've done things like I did some time in the military. I worked in an oil and gas company. I worked in a mining services company, sometimes as a lawyer, sometimes in a safety capacity. So that's that's what I do. I'm partner in a law firm called Jackson McDonald over here in WA. That's kind of what takes up 90% of my time, and probably for most people best known for some of my works, some of the books that I've written around safety. Probably where people would, if they recognise me at all, it would be around that area.
I'll say that'll be the case. And I was lucky enough to see you when you came over to New Zealand last year as well, and that was figuring because to be fair, for somebody that's both a lawyer and b a safety professional, most people would probably look at that and go, "Wow, that's going to be an interesting day." But it was incredibly fascinating, full of engagement, full of great insights. So
no, that's kind. Cheers, thanks for that.
Yeah, the only thing is I can't read books, mate. So I have to read one of them. That's why I thought I'd go see you in person instead.
If you see me in person, you've got the general gist of it. So.
Yeah, no, and it was absolutely fantastic. I rely heavily on Des for my intellectual reading material. Now I've got to ask Greg. Sorry, this isn't. I get I'm a little like a goldfish. I go around and around the bowl a little bit. In the background there, I can see. Is that your law gown? Is that what that is hanging on the wall there?
That one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Don't wear it very often.
Hey, Des, do you have one of them?
I don't. I never earned my stripes in that field. Got admitted to the bar, and that was my last day in practice.
Was that out of choice, Des?
That's not without merit. That is not without merit.
So Greg, I need some free legal advice. Des normally does a disclaimer at the start of each show. The fact that he doesn't have a law gown, should we be concerned?
No, you don't need a law. That's to be fair. We've got in the firm we like have a cupboard of them, and when you need one, you just go and grab one out of the cupboard. It's not mine. I don't own a brief bag. The last time I used it, and it's probably the only time I've used it in years, was when my daughter got admitted to court. And so you have an admission ceremony, and you all dress up in your frocks and go along and say nice words.
Do you get the wig? Do you get the wig thing? No wigs.
No, almost no one has. I don't think any jurisdictions have wigs anymore. They may have, like you don't see them very much.
So the next time, I've got to be fair, Perth now is probably the last frontier of Australia that I haven't conquered. When I'm over there, I could pop in and grab a gown and get into it. It sounds like a deal.
You kind of need more rock, but yeah.
Oh, nice.
Well,
hey, listen. So
you wouldn't be the first safety person who came wandering around thinking they knew about law more about law than lawyers. I'll give you the tip.
I can say that, Greg, I don't think I know more than safety people know about safety either. So I think you're safe with me, to be fair. I just talk a big game and don't actually admit to anything. Hey, listen. Well, so we're here to talk about a very particular topic. And in fact, I think one of your books touches very articulately on this topic. But just straight off the bat, right, if it's not documented, it did not happen. I'm just going to throw that sentence at you, Greg, and just kind of want you to let me know, what are your initial thoughts? What's your takeaway from that?
Well, the short answer is no. The fact that it's not documented doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It also doesn't mean that it's not provable in court. Okay, and I think in your episode on this, and I think it was Des who talked about it, or it might have been Andy talking about Oliver having his breakfast. We do things all the time. We do things all the time that we don't document, right?
Yep.
And then if something gets to a point where we need to evidence it, most of the time we evidence it by asking people what they saw, what they heard, what did they do. Okay. And the fact that you might produce a document, say, well, here's the safe work procedure that's been signed by the worker. That's not the end of the inquiry. That's kind of just the start of the inquiry. So, okay, now we know what you say should have happened. Let's go talk to the workers and find out what actually happened. And you'll find that in most investigations, full stop, but certainly safety investigations, the sort of, you follow the bouncing ball, it starts with the collection of documents.
Yeah.
And then when you're in the interview room being interviewed by the regulator, they've got 2 lever arch files full of the documents, and that's what they're putting to you. They're not saying the documents are the evidence of what occurred. They say the documents are evidence of what you say should have occurred. Let's find out what actually happened. And the signature on the document isn't the signature on the document also is kind of the starting point for the inquiry. I mean, I had a matter recently where I was acting for a group of employees, because you can't act for both the company and the workers, so you often have two, at least, lawyers working on these things. And most of the workers were being shown safe work procedures that they'd signed 3 years before. And they're being, do you know what this document is? It looks like a company document. It doesn't look familiar. Can go to the back page. Is that your signature? Oh, yeah, that's mine. Oh, on that date, yeah. Well, I must have seen it at some time. I don't remember anything about it. And that's when your inquiry starts.
Yeah, and I guess you could go down a rabbit hole from that point on, right? Interestingly enough, just kind of not making this all about me, but I was recently when I say recently, maybe about 18 months ago, had the regulator involved in an incident that I was on one of our sites. And interesting enough, though, you talk about the signature on the document. They pulled up multiple documents from this one worker and identified that his signature wasn't quite the same on them all. And it was interesting, they took that line of inquiry about how did I validate that it was the person signing the document that was sat in front of me as well, right? So
and again,
a whole other can of worms.
But I think the important thing about that conversation is the inquiry about whether the right person has been signing the documents or people have been signing it on their behalf is not a conversation about whether the work was done safely. It's a conversation about whether you enforced your own procedures.
Yes.
And we have lots of prosecutions of companies who have been prosecuted for failing to do everything reasonably practicable, because it's reasonably practicable to enforce your own procedures. And companies have been convicted for failing to enforce their own procedures, regardless of whether the failure caused or contributed to an accident. And I think a lot of people misunderstand that. So there's a case, Cummings and Multiplex, single-person fatality, Canberra Hospital, teaching hospital fatality, construction incident. And they had two organisations. RAR was a crane company, specialist crane company. Multiplex was the principal contractor. And sort of long story short, Multiplex introduced a document called an SSRA. Didn't have to do it, not legally required. Just they thought it was a good idea. Had to be signed by the crane operator and the rigger and a Multiplex supervisor before every lift. It was done for 2 lifts, not for the fatal lift. And Multiplex was charged, and in the proceedings, the defence argued and the prosecutor conceded and the court accepted that failing to complete the SSRA didn't cause or contribute to the accident. And if the SSRA had been completed, it probably wouldn't have prevented the accident. Multiplex is prosecuted for not completing the SSRA because that's their document that they said this is what we're going to do. So I think that's part of the misunderstanding of this stuff. I look, it doesn't matter if I just sign this stuff, because the fact that I sign it's going to have nothing to do with whether we work safely. Two different conversations.
How often does that? I mean, you must see it all the time, though, right, Greg? I mean, how often? I mean, do people just sign things thinking, there or thereabouts? When you sign into a site, often we just flick through the induction part real quick and we just sign onto it, right?
I think the majority of inductions and you sign on that you've attended a toolbox talk or a pre-start meeting. That has spectacularly little relationship to what you take away from those conversations.
Yes.
We sign on to JHAs, we sign off take 5s, we sign off on inspection checklists, all sorts of things. It happens all the time. And I think most of the time that signature tells us nothing about the level of understanding or comprehension of what we want people to understand from that documentation.
Yeah, no, fantastic insights. I mean, I've got questions like that. They're just flying into my head now, so I'll give somebody else a turn. I mean, Des, anything from you at this point, apart from one word?
Well, I said in the show that I think comments like that, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, comes from an imperfect understanding of evidence, especially when it's applied legally. And I'm not going to claim to have a perfect understanding myself, but I think that if practitioners and safety professionals were a little bit better versed on evidence and how it applied legally, the safety clutter problem would probably take care of itself overnight. You would probably not see a lot of the stuff that we're seeing in practice. representatives of the regulator probably wouldn't ask for documents in the first instance. They'd probably ask to speak to people in the first instance, or at least to observe themselves what's happening.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the second part, Des. I think the document, the trouble, part of the problem we have, I think, is if I'm a regulator, the documentation is the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
Because then I don't have to go out and do that work of observing. I can just ask for the document and I can tick a box myself. So the regulator has, I'm talking from a very much my jurisdiction perspective, and it's not a criticism of the regulator. I mean, they're overstretched and under-resourced and everything else. And that's what I think. I think the paperwork has become the abrogation of responsibility and the shortcut for everybody. So the easiest way for me to minimise supervision or minimise training is to make workers do a JHA, because then it's your job now to make sure you understand the risks with the work and how you're going to manage them. It's no longer my job to make sure as the employer I set up the right systems for you to succeed. But I mean, I think if the authors of the documents were held accountable for their implementation in a real way, that would clear up the safety clutter problem. If it said, well, the person we're going to prosecute when a procedure is not followed is the person who's authorised the procedure, you would see those documents evaporate overnight, I suspect.
Yeah, and that becomes I guess just the question that I was going to go down the road of too, and I guess there's stuff to touch on it is where do we think this reliance on documentation came from? And as you suggested there, Greg, it's probably the path of least resistance, right? But could you foresee potentially those document owners as such ending up being held responsible for what they produce?
I can't point to a history of it, unfortunately. And it depends. Like if you're talking about a single person fatality in a prosecution in a magistrate's court, the inquiry simply never goes that far. If you get a major catastrophic event and you get some sort of significant public inquiry, you certainly get a lot more relationship between document owners and the document. So there's a significant inquiry that happened in WA, not WA, it was a national inquiry that happened in Commonwealth Waters, Montara Commission of Inquiry. And there was a significant part of that inquiry dealt with cross-examination of a leader in relation to a single slide from an induction pack that said something like the standard you accept, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept, or something like that. Okay, so it's some sort of kumbaya bullshit motherhood statement that we throw out in safety all the time.
Yeah.
And it's sitting up on the screen. You got the commissioner. It's like a royal commission, but not quite. Is that kind of level? And this fellow's in the witness box for several days, and every time the organisation or the commission points to a failing in the organisation systems, that slide would be brought up. Would you agree, Mr. So-and-so, that what you have described represents a reasonably significant departure from what is on the screen? And this guy had to admit that he was part of making the slide back. He presented that information in the past, da-da-da-da-da. Now, none of which anybody in an operational role would think that there's any real relationship between that kind of bullshit motherhood statement and daily operational work. But if in the witness box under cross-examination, he was there for about 2 days, and that thing keeps popping up, and you get these allegations being put to him, you would have to admit, wouldn't you, Mr. So-and-so, that represents a significant failure of leadership of the organisation, and he has to admit yes.
Wow.
Now, nobody is contemplating when they pluck something like that from their lazy book of cliches and quotes and sticks it into a PowerPoint slide, that it's going to end up in a royal commission with one of their managers being cross-examined on it.
Wow.
But that's the logical extension.
Can you just give me 1 minute? Sorry, just 1 minute. Light it up, boys. Burn those manuals. Just pour the petrol on. Light them up. Sorry, I was just authorising. I'm outside of my office here. I've just got a bonfire starting of. I would do.
Can I suggest a different hierarchy of action?
Okay, not stop the fire. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, for the time being, because I suspect you're just in breach of your own procedures to do some sort of change management process.
Well, I got no more permit books. I can't write permits.
Right. The problem with the documents, it's a bit hard to know, chicken and egg here. We tend to have too many of them. They tend not to be very well written. We tend to add to them just incessantly. But at the end of the day, your sort of golden scenario is we have a document that describes how the work's going to be done. We have evidence that the workers understand how the work is meant to be done. And we have evidence that the work is done that way. That's what it's meant to be. So we often talk about work as imagined and work as done. There's actually, from a legal risk management perspective, there's 3 layers. There's work as written, work as imagined, and work as done. Because we write what we think should happen. Over time, we start to think this is what actually happens. And in reality, something else is happening. And we've got to get those 3 aligned. Now, to the extent that you can't demonstrate that alignment, you've got legal risk. And so I guess the real conversation is, what are we doing to understand if that alignment exists? I think that's the more important issue.
Well, it was interesting. I was just literally walked off a site, and I won't disclose where I am for fear of termination of employment. I was talking to this contractor, and I said, so how do you find working here? There's a lot, because where I was currently at on the site that I was visiting, there's a lot of systems and processes. And he goes, he was a bit cagey. And I said, no, this doesn't bother me either way, really. What are your thoughts? He goes, I think I've been told off for pretty much everything you can be told off for. I was like, wow, that's awesome. Was it more than once for everything? And he went, no, it's only been once for everything. And I'm like, well, there we go. You're obviously learning, right? But it was interesting, the number of systems and processes that this individual had to remember was just nigh on impossible. Yeah. And so the only way he could remember them effectively was to get them wrong and to be told off, which was an interesting... It was a eureka. Obviously, knowing that I was coming onto this show to talk to you about all this later on, I was like, the heavens were aligning, which is quite worrying in the same front, right?
We still see examples of workers rocking up to site day one. Right, boys, into the crib room. Here's a folder of procedures. You've got to read them all and sign that you've read and understood. That's still a thing. Okay.
Yep.
And
crazy.
And this is where I would take Des's point, in that if people actually understood the evidentiary value of that process, you can't imagine anybody making a conscious decision that this is how we're going to do it, because it achieves nothing. Nothing.
In fact, it sounds, if I've got it correct, you're potentially setting yourself up for failure right there.
More likely than not. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Andy, you've been exceptionally quiet, which is unusual of you. Anything you'd like to add or throw into this conversation and actually positively contribute?
I've been deep in thought. I've gone around in circles. Greg, Greg, this is fantastic. It's nice to have someone, well, certainly a qualified lawyer on the show. So one of the interesting things that you pointed out was you mentioned reasonably practicable.
Yeah.
Come on, let's hear it, Andy. Come on.
No. And sorry, I couldn't help myself. And also the opposite. Well, there's the 2 elements, right? There's the business meeting reasonably practicable. And then on the other side of that, you've got this ability to set yourself up for prosecution.
Yeah.
So what's the relationship between those two things? I mean, initially I thought it's like a balancing act. So we've got to have lots of systems and we want to do the best that we can. So we need to fill in these forms, do these procedures. But on the other side, it seems to be the more procedures we have that aren't necessary or legally obligated to, the more likely we are to be held against them in any sort of action or prosecution.
Yeah. So there's a couple of points there. One is, what do you actually legally have to have?
Yeah.
And most jurisdictions, it's a hell of a lot less than people think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if I just pick that, I mean, I know New Zealand and Australia is broadly aligned around WHS, and there's a general, in our regulations at least, and I think it's in New Zealand's as well, specific requirements for the PCBU to do risk assessments.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's fine. It doesn't say you have to use the matrix, for example, which is the bane of my existence.
Oh, same.
It doesn't talk about extraordinarily large Excel spreadsheets of, none of that gets talked about in the regs. This is something we've kind of come to as an industry for some reason.
Yeah.
So on the one side of your equation, Andy, I just caution that we don't need as much as I think we do. We don't need as much as I think we need. On the one hand.
Yeah.
But on the other side of the coin, even if we take something that we do need, so safe work method statements for high risk construction work, even though it says this is what we need and this is what the elements of it are, what we've done, there's two problems. One, even if you just specifically comply with the regulations, you can create legal risk because you've got to describe in there how you're doing things. And again, once you'd start describing this is how we're going to do it, you don't do it, you've got a problem. But then we've also taken this thing that we have to do and just bastardized it into this monstrous beast covering every single possible combination, or trying to cover every possible combinations in ways that we don't have to. But I think the two things you're talking about there are quite related because it's an outcome-based legislation in broad terms. We're not told what to do to demonstrate reasonably practicable. That's up to us. Because we're so concerned about demonstrating it, we go probably beyond what we need to do, and then we start creating processes that we can't comply with. And once we've said this is what we're going to do, that's what becomes reasonably practicable. And if we're not doing it, that creates the legal risk. It kind of becomes reinforcing.
It does. And I think that's the mess that we're certainly in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Where actually people think there's safety. It's that whole concept of if you can't tie knots, tie lots.
Yeah.
And that whole idea, well, actually that's absurd because every knot damages the rope, right? There's problems with it. It increases all sorts of implications of that. And it's the same in safety. We're not sure, so we'll just add more documents. The problem is that you've got more documents, so you've got less engagement. And it also sounds from this that you've potentially set yourself up to more legal risk.
And
Des.
No, sorry.
Sorry. I was just going to say, Des, they're using big words. Do you want to jump in on this, mate?
I want to hear the rest of the point, actually, because it's there's a burning question is if I'm in construction, if all the other construction companies are doing some sort of inspection, am I now obliged due to reasonably practicable to do the same?
It's a good question. Because what would normally happen if something's gone wrong and I'm being prosecuted? It's the prosecution's job to allege what reasonably practicable thing I should have done. Okay, so I've got to do everything reasonably practical to ensure my workers are not exposed to hazards. Somebody's hurt, someone loses an arm, falls down a hole, whatever. And so the prosecution says, for example, you should have done daily worksite inspections. That was something reasonably practicable you could have done. Your failure to do that caused X, Y, and Z. So the argument we're then having is whether daily workplace inspections are a reasonably practicable thing for us to do. Now, If there is a specific regulation that says you will do daily workplace inspections, that's pretty good evidence that I should have been doing them. Next in line would be, is there a code of practice that describes what we should be doing? And in the absence of either of those things, then we have to start relying on industry practice as evidenced by other witnesses. So if the regulator, if I say, no, we didn't do them daily, we did them weekly, and we did them weekly for these reasons, what yada, 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 therefore it's not reasonably practicable for us to do them daily. We have an argument about that. The regulator would then need to produce witnesses to say why it was reasonably practicable to do that. Bearing in mind the onus of proof is on them. They've got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that's what we should have been, or it was reasonably practicable for us to do that. And of course, you run into and it's always difficult, because is it physically possible for me to do daily inspections? Maybe it is, all right? But reasonably practicable is not physically possible. But finding where that line starts and ends is always difficult. It's always difficult. I'm reasonably confident to say that industry best practice isn't necessarily the same as reasonably practicable. All right. So just because you have a major construction house, for example, that is running autonomous drones that can have safe zones around all workers and that can be monitored from a station, right, doesn't suddenly mean that every residential construction company in New Zealand has to be running the same technology. Now, again, what's really difficult is that can shift over time. So once upon a time, light curtains on manufacturing machinery were state-of-the-art technology. Okay. I think that has shifted over time to a point where it's probably now accepted standard industry practice, probably in codes of practice for machinery guarding and that sort of thing. So leading edge technology or industry best practice can over time evolve. But I think the best evidence, if I'm an organisation, the best evidence of, or the best source of where I should be going for reasonably practicable is probably in the codes of practice most of the time, if they exist for the work that I'm involved in. If they don't, then you're really relying on your risk assessments as evidence of what it was practicable to do.
And I guess that's where it gets a little bit tricky for some of those more niche type industries or niche type businesses. And then, like you said, I think the word you used, or the phrase you used, was path of least resistance, goes down this documentation type route, right? Yeah. So that becomes the challenge.
Well, and again, I think, so what frustrates me is when I see like a small business that carries out a couple of activities, and within those activities, there's 2 or 3 things that could really hurt people. Okay. So the risk assessment doesn't need to be more than, we do X, this is how we make sure people don't get hurt. We do X and someone could lose their hand. That's probably the worst scenario, and because of that we'll call that high risk. Instead of these, I'll go down this number and I'll go that number, I'll match something up here unless it's the wrong colour, and then I'll do some Harry Potter bullshit magic and then I'll make it this colour. So I think, we get so caught up in the process of the production of the documents, we actually lose sight of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, we're starting we started a movement, Greg, #burn the matrix. You can subscribe at any time. In fact, would you be a patron?
Plenty of smarter people than me have written really good academic papers on the invalidity of that as a tool. I don't mind if organisations want to use it at an organisational level to structure where they think their key risks. I really object to asking a frontline construction worker who left high school at year 10 to be a construction worker to suddenly start consistently applying these kind of methodologies. It's just 100%. Totally unsuited for those sorts of people. And that's not I'm not having a crack at them for their intellectual nous or anything like that. They're brilliant at what they do, okay? But the amount of thought they actually have to go into to give that tool anything like any sort of plausibility is huge. And I think the academic research says that if it's anything more than a 3x3 matrix, it's got no credibility at all mathematically. And most of them are either 5x5s or 5x7s. You see these ones where it's health, safety, quality, environment, and some other thing, trying to just smash it all into one multicolored box.
Oh, I've got to admit, I have been lucky enough to work for an organisation where I had the same argument, and at a worker sort of site level, we managed to move to a point where we weren't asking them to use a matrix. We were asking them to make an assessment based on a possible, what they believed an outcome could be, right? And we used your sort of first 80 type stuff, which people can relate to as an assessment. And at board level, they still felt that they needed the matrix, and that was fine. And it was quite liberating, actually. And when you have a conversation with, like you said, somebody that's really good at what they do, but isn't a statistical mathematician, around, mate, if this went wrong, what are you going to end up in hospital? You're just going to need a Band-Aid. What are you going to need, right? And they can articulate that, which makes it so much more plausible for them to be getting involved.
So finding that combination between the not negotiables and the subjective view of the worker, I think, is the interesting thing, right? So, they never stand under a suspended load. Is that a not negotiable when I just have to reach in to grab the tagline, the sort of thing? Yeah. How do you, mate, I'm not going to get hurt. I'm just grabbing the tagline, or I don't need to clip on because I'm just going from here to here and I'll clip on when I get over there. It's like, what are the not negotiables, which I think there are a place for. Mm-hmm. And what are the bits where we can adequately support worker discretion?
Yep.
Nice.
And one of the things I really dislike about the whole safety narrative at the moment is we seem to really be polarized. So when you hear people talk about worker discretion, you have a lot of behavioural-based safety advocates saying, "Oh, we're just going to give everything to the workers to decide," which is not what it means. When you have behavioural-based safety people talking about structured review programs, you talk the sort of new view, some of the new view, or some of the discretion advocates are highly critical of that, this sort of policing and compliance-based. And the reality is the truth is somewhere in the middle. But we really have a very poor conversation in safety at the moment about what we actually need. It seems to be very polarized commercial camps fighting over products.
Where have you been for the last 3 seasons, Greg? I tell you what,
you've just summed up 3 seasons of work in 2 minutes.
So we don't need much to get our point across.
No, we don't need these at all.
See, there's another deliberate misinterpretation. This is how all our problems start, Brenton. Somebody reads a procedure and says, "Oh, we don't need that at all." That's not what I said.
Well, I mean, hopefully, what I'm hoping Des has taken away from this is you can be both smart, intelligent, and qualified, and actually use your words.
And you called me a fanboy. Listen to you.
Yeah.
It's just so easy to talk to.
I think what Des should really be taking away from this is that he needs new friends.
Thank you. We were friends. Greg, I'm sure we could talk for weeks on this. And listen, I'd be great to pop over to Perth and grab a pint or 2 of lager and chew the fat a bit more.
Best way to do it. We did a thing down in Bunbury. We had a whiteboard in the pub. We ran this workshop, and we had this networking thing, and people said questions. They pulled the whiteboard out, and we're just in the pub, whiteboarding and talking. It was just best way to do safety. I thought it was excellent.
Yeah, nice. Well, listen, we might have to do a collab over there with that, because that just sounds brilliant. But unfortunately, we can't afford your hourly rate, so we need to start to wrap up this this little shindig we got going on here. Now, you told me to kibosh the bonfire that I had started outside. So just kind of in wrapping up your thoughts. I mean, I know this might be hard because you've got a lot of theory on this, but wrapping up your thoughts for those listening around, if it's not documented, it did not happen. I mean, what would your final words of wisdom be for those listening in?
There is a Queensland coroner's inquest, the name of which I can't recall, but I can send a link to it. And it's a single person fatality where a worker was killed unloading a vehicle. And there's a paragraph towards the end of the coroner's inquest where it says that we apply risk management processes to produce a suite of documents that can pass audit requirements. But the coroner goes on to say the evidence at this inquest demonstrates that the workers in the field find the documents hard to comprehend and of limited relevance to their daily activities. Okay. So if you've got a big bundle of procedures that you're thinking about setting on fire, I think organisations are duty bound to go through the process of working out whether workers understand their processes and whether those processes are relevant to their daily activities. And if you can't answer those two questions, I don't think you get to first base in any sort of legal risk management, and probably not any sort of real safety management either. I think there's two things I keep in front of mind. I've got them up on my walls. Do your workers understand the systems? Are they relevant? And the other one is pinched directly from the Pike River Royal Commission that talks about the board received no information proving the effectiveness of crucial systems. And I think those two things go hand in glove. How do we prove the effectiveness of our processes? And a signature on a piece of paper is not that.
No, couldn't agree more. Brilliant. Well said, Greg. Thank you. Andy, I mean, your final thoughts as we wrap up this bonus episode here on if it did not get documented, it did not happen.
Sensational. Absolutely sensational. That phrase has been thrown at me so many times as a consultant. And I always find it difficult to fight back in the moment because it's often so ingrained and the person becomes very defensive. And I think that's why it's so hard to break this down. But I'll keep fighting the good fight, Greg.
The flip side of it, Andy, is okay if it's documented, you're accountable for it.
Yeah, and that was where I was going. That's where my thought of my thinking and my notes is going. And that throws it back, like you indicated at the start of the conversation. Let's hold the people that created these documents accountable.
Yeah.
And then we get a different outcome.
Yeah, I think so.
Fantastic. Des, I mean, your final thoughts? I mean, what are you thinking?
Well, as you alluded to at the beginning of the show, I'm familiar with a lot of Greg's material, and every time I come away from a written article or a book or an interview or a webinar, I'm always reflecting on my practices and what I'm doing to perpetuate the problem or fix it. And I think if there's any takeaway from this, it's a bit of self-reflection from everyone.
What about my drinking problem? What self-reflection on what specifically?
About our friendship, apparently.
Oh, we might need to get a good lawyer involved to help us work through it. Listen, Greg, absolutely brilliant. I think my key takeaway from all of this is balance, right?
Yep.
And I really like that. I like the way you wrapped it up there, and I'll definitely go back and grab in the show notes on this because there's some real good stuff that came out of it. And I think, like you said as well, we seem to be in a world of extremes, right? Let the workers do whatever they want and hope like hell to make it out the other end, or we document the bejeebers out of it. And it's trying to find that balance, right? And I think that's the key takeaway for me from that. But listen, Greg, on behalf of the show, absolutely stunning. I mean, like I said, I saw you in Auckland in person, and that was a phenomenal experience. And I just wish we had more time. Otherwise, we could go for weeks. And it's been an absolute privilege to have you on the show. And thank you for giving up your time for us and for all those that are listening. And look forward to a beer in a pub in Perth.
Look forward to it, Brenton. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your time.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Greg.
All right. Catch you soon.